Chapter 17. Then we can too. The queen and the king entered the new kitchen, carrying heavy sacks, which they placed on the work table near the fire. Speaking to cook Agnes, the queen said, "This is a sack of peas, and here's some oats," said the king. Jumping from his spot by the hearth, Ronduin spoke excitedly. "Father, mother, we went down to the first floor and we found out that this flood is 4 steps deeper than the flood that Cook Agnes remembers. But that's not all that we found out. The water level is higher than it was when I helped Sir Andrew with the green boat, and it hasn't been raining, so it's a mystery, and the plank has floated away." "We have to see this," said the queen. "Yes, right away," said the king. Within minutes, Ronduin, the queen, and the king were marching down the stairs. "See the plank?" asked Ronduin. "It's floating near the dining hall." "I see it," said the queen. "I counted 22 dry steps, and the water is almost to the very top of this last step," said Ronduin. "And the water is up to the new dock." "You have noticed the important things," said the king. "I want you to make a daily report. Please come down here every morning and count the dry steps." "Certainly, father," said Ronduin. "Do you think the water might continue to rise?" "Possibly," said the king. "Why is the water getting deeper?" asked Ronduin. "We only had a tiny bit of rain since Sir Andrew took the boat to town." "This is a good puzzle for you," said his mother. "Take your time and think about it." His father nodded and smiled. Ronduin was surprised that his parents didn't answer his question. At the same time, he was glad he would get to figure out the puzzle on his own. That afternoon, the sun shone brightly in the sky, but the wind howled, and a chill in the air made Ronduin wonder whether ice would form. The young prince and his parents pulled chairs close to the fire in the sitting room. Here, his mother mended an apron. Ronduin continued sewing the 2 squares together, and his father sat quietly looking into the flames. "What are you sewing, Ronduin?" asked the king. "I'm making a little bag to throw and catch," said Ronduin. "I'll fill it with dried peas if Cook Agnes can spare some." "I used to have a cloth bag of peas when I was a boy," said the king. After some time, the king pulled a chair to the tall shelves. He climbed up on the chair and took down a large book from the highest shelf. He carried it to the table and, before he put it down, he moved a mug half full of cider from the big table to the small table by the window. Ronduin knew why his father had moved the drink. Every book in the castle, and there were only 7 of them, had been created by monks who wrote every word and drew every picture by hand. Some were in Latin, and they were mostly too hard for him to read, but Ronduin loved looking at the colorful drawings that brightened the pages. If the king had not moved the drink, Ronduin would have moved it himself, for he knew that books were too valuable to be on a table with a drink that might spill. The king sat at the table, slowly turning the pages of the big, leather-bound book. After some time, he said, "Here it is, Ronduin. Come and look at this." Ronduin stood behind his father, looking over his shoulder at the open book. The king stopped at a page and said, "These are our ancestors, Ronduin." Ronduin admired the picture of a king on a throne wearing a blue robe and surrounded by attendants. The next page showed a picture of a castle. "Is that this castle?" asked Ronduin. "It's missing a turret." "Yes, this is a drawing of the castle before it was completely finished. And look at this. It's a drawing of the old barn that was gone before I was a boy." The king turned the page. "This part explains why they replaced the old barn with the barn on the hill.
It says here that long, long ago, a flood carried so much water into the barn that they had to bring all the animals into the castle to keep them safe.
The king continued,
Here is a drawing of the castle and the new barn during another flood long ago. You can see that the old barn is no longer there. It says here that they took down the old barn after the first flood, and they built the new one up on the hill so the animals would have a place to graze if ever it flooded here again.
So there have been many floods? Asked Ronduin, and many times our ancestors had to stay in the castle for a long time?
Yes, there have been many floods,
Said the king.
but maybe only one or two in each person's lifetime. It seems to us like being stuck in the castle is unusual, and it is for us. But if this very old castle could speak, it would tell us that in the very long life of a castle, floods happen again and again.
I sort of wish we still had the old barn, said Ronduin. I would like to bring the cows into the castle. Then we would have milk.
But the cows would be unhappy if they could not wander outside,
said the king. The king studied the big book for some time. Then he closed it with great care and a long sigh.
I had hoped to learn how many days it took for the floodwaters to disappear, but the book did not tell me. Still, it helps to think about all the ancestors who, like us, had to stay inside for a long time. It helps to know that they figured out how to live differently during those times. And if they could learn how to live differently, then we can too.
The queen said, Speaking of living differently, we have become the workers who fill the boxes with firewood, and this one is empty, and the wood box in the kitchen is running low.
Looks like fetching more wood is next,
said the king. I can help, said Ronduin. The queen put down her sewing and said, Your father and I will go. We need you here to keep the fire lit.
We'll be back soon,
said the king. Again, Ronduin found himself alone in the sitting room. Right away, he picked up his jump rope. He had only jumped 3 jumps when it happened. The flying rope caught the edge of the small table near the window. The mug of cider on the table fell over, and the table tipped just a bit so it leaned on the chair. Oh, drat! Now I've made a flood, shouted Ronduin in surprise. Ronduin quickly opened the queen's sewing kit and pulled out a pair of his old breeches that were waiting to be mended. He used these for a cleaning rag, knowing they could be washed and dried. He sat on the floor wiping up the puddle of cider when the floor was dry. When the floor was dry, Ronduin thought, I can take these to the steps when I go there in the morning and wash them and then hang them on the balcony rail by the chickens. Now Ronduin, still seated, scooted back until he was almost under the table. He wanted to be sure he had wiped up all of the spilled cider. He felt something wet dripping on the back of his neck. He stood and saw that the slightly tilted table still had a puddle on it. The wooden rim on the edge of the table had kept the puddle from pouring onto the floor. Cider dripped from a small crack in the rim. This is why Ronduin now had a wet neck and a wet back. The puddle on the table, drip by drip, was becoming a puddle on the floor. Drat again, said Ronduin. Even more flooding. Ronduin jumped up and went back to the sewing box and found scraps of cloth. He put the small table back in its normal position. Then he carefully cleaned up every last drip of spilled cider. Chapter 18, A Bowl of Flowers. Ronduin remembered his dream as he pulled back the curtains in his room and saw the mountains in the distance, lit by the rising sun. It was the sight of the mountains that popped the dream out of his sleep and into his thinking. It was a dream about the summer journey he took with his parents and Sir Andrew every year to visit his mother's relatives who lived in the mountains. He knew he was remembering a dream and not revisiting a memory because Mirabel was with them, riding with Rondoin in the back of the cart. Of course, Mirabel had never joined his family on a summer journey. In real life, she didn't even know that Rondoin's parents were the king and the queen. In the dream, they rode through the quiet village on a hot summer day before the shops opened. Then they traveled on the bumpy dirt road that ran alongside the river that flowed down from the hills. Rondoin remembered telling Mirabel in the dream, "My favorite place is in the meadow of flowers, high on the mountainside. My relatives in the mountains call it the bowl because it's shaped like a very big bowl, far bigger even than the fields in the front of the castle. They tell me that the spring rains fill the bowl so it looks like a bowl of soup. But we never come here in the spring. We always travel when spring has long passed and it's become very hot." It was a long journey, and Rondoin and Mirabel became tired of sitting. They got permission to run ahead for a long stretch, so they both ran up the road as fast as they could, which was not as fast as usual because the road was uphill. Rondoin noticed while he ran that the river beside the road now ran swiftly, unlike the river near the village that flowed slowly and calmly. These stretches of the river bubbled and splashed over rocks as it tumbled down the hill. Just before they reached the bowl, the road became very steep and pulled away from the river. Here, the two children climbed back into the cart. They couldn't see the river through the trees, but they could hear the roar as it fell over a cliff as a waterfall. After the steep section, the road flattened again, and they entered the bowl. Sir Andrew stopped the cart, and Mirabel and Rondoin stood up and looked around at the spectacular bowl-shaped meadow. The mountains formed a ring around the bowl, and, even though it was so hot that it felt like standing before a fire, some of the mountain peaks wore bright white scarves fashioned of pure snow. "Oh my, oh my, oh my!" exclaimed Mirabel, turning round and round, admiring the beauty of the great meadow dressed in flowers of every rainbow color. "I have never seen anything so very beautiful." Noticing a path, they jumped off the cart and ran through an area of mostly blue and yellow flowers. The path led them to the river, which flowed peacefully across the meadow. Here, they removed their shoes and socks and waded into the icy stream. "This cold water feels so good on this hot day," said Mirabel. Rondoin and Mirabel each sat down on a rock with their feet in the water. Looking downstream, they saw a line of huge boulders at a spot where the river plunged over the cliff. One of these enormous rocks looked like it had cracked in two pieces. The stream ran through this crack and then could no longer be seen. Beyond their vision, the stream fell as a waterfall. Standing at the window, Rondoin replayed all of this in his mind as if it had just happened, but he could remember no more of his dream. Instead of seeing the dream, Rondoin now saw the lake outside the window covering the land that should soon be planted. Rondoin wondered how long would he have to wait to see barley and oats springing out of the fields. How long, he wondered, would he have to wait to see Mirabel and his other friends from school? Rondoin sighed, remembering his mornings in school and his friends laughing and singing together. Instead of seeing school friends every morning, I now see chicken friends, and they must be hungry, he thought. He put on his linen shirt and a pair of breeches. Rondoin picked up the bucket of food and the jug of water he had left by the door. Today, when Rondoin entered the chicken area, Sunrise ran across the balcony to greet him. She seemed to know he would bring food. He pulled a crust of old bread out of the bucket and crouched down and held out his hand. Sunrise grabbed it instantly. But when Ronduin reached out to pick her up, Sunset darted in to steal her prize, and Sunrise ran off with it into her basket. Sunset chased Sunrise into her basket, and Ronduin laughed. He dumped and refilled their water bowl and filled their food bowl, and then said, "I'll come back to visit later, to collect the eggs. By the way, your food bowl is full, so you don't have to fight over that scrap of stale bread. Now, I have to check on the floodwater on the first floor. You know, the spot where you got off the boat." Ronduin no longer found the scaffolding in the third-floor hallway, nor the piled-up furniture in the second-floor hallway, to be unusual. He was now used to dodging here and there to go anywhere in the castle. Ronduin eagerly opened the door to the stairwell to the first floor. Will the water be at the same level, or will it be lower, or higher than yesterday? He wondered. And why did the water get deeper without rain? Ronduin hurried down the steps while eyeing the water in the entryway. He noticed that some of the sections of scaffolding in the dining hall had moved. They are now floating, thought Ronduin, so the water must be deeper. Standing on the last dry step by the water, Ronduin counted that step and the steps above him. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Yesterday it was 22 steps, said Ronduin out loud. He crouched down on the last dry step and peered over the edge. He said. The water comes halfway up this step, so it rose about half a step. Now, Ronduin walked halfway up the 21 steps and sat down. This is a quiet place for thinking, he whispered. He held the hem of his linen shirt between his fingers and started picturing water, all kinds of water. He remembered the lake shore where he and Mirabel always said goodbye after their runs together. He remembered the well-behaved river running alongside the town and the mischievous river tumbling down the hills. He thought about the cold water and the stream through the bowl and the way it seemed to disappear as it went through the crack in the rock. Ronduin had never seen the bowl when it filled up from the spring rains, but he could imagine it. He guessed that the line of rocks held it back and that it took time for the extra water to move through the crack. Now Ronduin remembered the cider spill. It wasn't water, but it was like water, he thought. And it made a puddle on the table that was held back by the rim. Just like the rim of rocks that holds water in the bowl. And the cider dripped out off the table through a crack. And the water flows out of the bowl through a crack in the rock. All of this thinking of water brought Ronduin to a next step in his thinking. He hadn't put it into words yet, but he saw something in his imagination. Suddenly, understanding why the water was still rising, Ronduin jumped up and ran up the stairs. Opening the door, he saw his mother and father at the end of the hallway, just about to step into the new kitchen. Ronduin ran toward them, waving his arms and calling out in his loudest voice, "I figured it out! I know why the water is rising, and it rose a half a step since yesterday. And I had a dream, and I spilled cider, and all of that helped me figure it out."
"Whoa," said Ronduin's father, as Ronduin ran up to them. "Let's sit, and you can tell us all about what you figured out. Slowly, please, so we can understand it."